Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. My name is Xiaoyu Weng. I'm the artistic director of Tanoto Art Foundation. It's really wonderful to gather here. We're gonna start on time because I know there's a lot going on today. And maybe a little bit introduction of the Tanoto Art Foundation. I think some of you probably have followed our programs. For people who are new here, Tanoto Art Foundation is based in Singapore. It's a non-for-profit art organization that we launched just this year in January. It felt like a long time already. I can't believe it's still 2025. And the mission of the foundation is to connect people to the art of our time and also creating formally unseen connections, especially among the arts communities in Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Today's program is part of our TAF Conversation Series. It is coinciding with the opening of Singapore Biennale, which we have the honor to support 4 artists with their art productions that are being featured in the Biennale. Besides our speakers here today, we also supported the work by artists Gala Porras Kim and Ayesha Singh. So we're looking forward to also see their work in the show. Before I start the conversation with the artists, I also want to give a little bit of introduction of each of them. Probably you're already familiar with their work, both fantastic artists featured in the Biennale. Ayesha Singh is an artist who lives and works in India. Born in 1990, she creates site-specific works that question dominant perspectives in history as embodied by architecture and urban planning. Her practice, grounded in research and critical spatial interventions, explores how built spaces reflect the politics of nation building, power dynamics, migration, and displacement, while exposing the exclusions of women from cultural histories. She is best known for collaborative projects that emphasize coexistence and reveal the erasure of lived history through construction, restoration, and destruction. Her work spans participatory performances with poetry, kinetic sculptures, sculptural line drawings, video, graphite drawings on paper, and public scaffold installations created with community involvement. We're very happy to have you here. Cui Jie creates paintings that, by incorporating diverse real and fantasy layers, explore the heterogeneous perspectives in various fields and geopolitical context. She meticulously deals with each sculptural and architectural layer and represents the process through which the modern world has undergone enormous and monumental changes. Delicate and calm, gentle and emotionally charged, Cui's landscape and interior paintings present comparative studies of cities and urban environments. For the artist, the cities she depicts are closely associated with her personal history. One can identify in the subject matter Bauhaus architectural principles, ideologies of Chinese propaganda art, Soviet communist aesthetics, or the Japanese metabolism architectural movement, among others. In rendering specific cities, architecture, structures, and landscapes, Cui explores the embedded history of perspectives and shredly proposes the political meanings of distance, angles, and time. Thank you so much for coming, Cui Jie, with us. And we also have Judy Chia, who is going to be our interpreter today for Cui Jie. Cui Jie will be answering the question and conduct the conversation in Mandarin. Also, I just want to say a few words of both artists' practice. I believe this is the first time you are sitting together for a conversation. I do think I find a lot of interesting connection in both of your works, despite very different mediums and upbringings and experiences and cultural context. And also for TAF, this year our research theme is on materiality, and we're gonna carry this on every year with a different theme and topic. And I also see how you guys both use architecture and built environment and urban space as a material, both as a source of inspiration, but ways of manipulation and interpretation. So we're gonna talk more about that in our conversation. With that, we're gonna start. So just a little bit also housekeeping. The conversation is gonna last about 45 minutes. Then we will have a 15-minute Q&A. So we're happy to take questions from the audience. And then we will have a little bit time for you to get some more refreshments after the conversation. Maybe you wanna connect with the artist. And we'll wrap up around 6:30. Also, a little announcement, we have a new Art Foundation opening event tonight. It's called Kim Association. The program is gonna start after we wrap up here, so if you're interested, you can also head your way over there. We wanted to be more collaborative in our effort in bringing more art activities into Singapore. So just that, and then with that, I will start. Maybe you wanna have the clicker. Yeah. So yeah, maybe we can go to your first image already, Ayesha. Okay, it's a beautiful portrait of you. Yeah, so I think your sculpture and installation practice a very strong connection with historical architecture, as you know, if we see from the pictures. You also have a lot of reference. Can you give us an introduction of these architectural style that you're referencing? Because personally, I'm also very curious about their histories, aesthetics that attracts you, and how did you become interested in them?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to the Tanoto Art Foundation for supporting this. I'll start by just contextualizing this work a little bit, because since over a decade now in India, we're seeing the rise of sort of Puritan rhetoric around identity, but also around the way in which hierarchy is constructed in society and in the way in which people are treated. And these works actually started off as amalgamations of spaces that spoke of different layered histories within a particular site. And this work was shown in Bondi Beach. This is outside of Sydney. And it overlooks the Pacific Ocean. And at this point, I was actually researching stepwells and thinking a lot about old Indian architecture that looks at water and responds to water, but also spaces that are considered sacred in a way. And I came across this one particular stepwell in Delhi itself, which is the city that I grew up in, which looked at, it's called Agresan Ki Bauli, and Bauli means stepwell. Angresan is the name of a king that it references. The ASI, which is the Archaeological Survey of India, a government body, has spoken about how the history of who built this space is completely unknown. But a lot of history in India is actually communicated through oral means, and not all of it has been written down. And so local myth about this space spoke about the way Agresan, the king, had built this space, and how he was the founder of the Agarwal community. And while on the other hand, this space was restored and sort of constructed when it was dilapidated by Lodhi, or during the Delhi Sultanate, which is where the Persian arches come into its architecture. So while India right now is going through a sort of conflict and divisive rhetoric towards a particular community, this was the mixture of various communities coming together to look after a particular space. And that space referenced water. So this work itself, when you walk around it, the lines sort of overlap, or even when like the sun shines, the way in which the shadow falls on the floor, it almost looks like the overlapping of different timelines or those of different storylines. And this is what this work was about. It actually comes from expanded practice of a series of works titled Hybrid Drawings that I've been working on for a long time. The idea is that you actually encounter a drawing in space, the way in which you'd imagine drawing on paper, if you could extrude that and make it as such that one could walk around and experience a drawing physically. These works actually, this one was installed in Delhi, so it referenced the architecture of Delhi. But on the floor, the sort of lines that you see was to reference perspective drawings, which is how we're sort of initially taught how to draw as kids when you're learning art, but also when you're learning architecture, is to have a triangle, and then there's a horizon that crosses it. And all the buildings become sort of smaller and smaller as they come towards what we call the vanishing point, which is where everything sort of disappears. And here what we did was to have that vanishing point in the center of the room, as such that when you walk around and see the works, they flatten and collapse into this vertical line. So thinking of ways in which this oversimplification of identities was taking place, but what that erasure actually sort of visually could do. And this was then sort of expanded into a two-perspective drawing. And this particular work looked at many other buildings. This one looked at 5 cities in India with layered architectural history. So Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Jaipur, and Kolkata. And picked up on here the way in which sort of there's this, when you're walking around, there's a sort of visual collapse and expand of the work itself. So the way in which, maybe I'll explain that a little later, but the way in which time works, or thinking about timelines, here this work actually looks at 2 sort of perspectival archetypes. One is to look at the way in which we think of perspective in Mughal paintings, which is between 7th to 12th century, which comes through with the hybrid drawings themselves. And then the second is Bruno Lecci's sort of Renaissance Italian way of sort of studying perspective, which is how we still study perspective today in India as well. Yeah, is that it? Yeah.
Definitely, that's really great, and I also really like how the way you talk about how these collapsing of perspectives is a visual representation of the oversimplification of identity. I think that is a really great way to put your work in terms of its relationship with space. I find it fascinating. I think my follow-up question is because I've seen your work presented in different space. The first image we saw is actually facing the ocean. It's a very natural kind of open land. And then here we see the work in a white cube in a gallery space. And if I understand it correctly, for the Singapore Biennale, your work is in a historical site, but it's also a public accessible space. It seems you're very versatile in terms of, situating your work on different kind of environments. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work process in terms of imagining the relationship with your work and how you negotiate different kind of space, because a white cube is obviously very different from anything that has this natural outside influence and perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think the one thing I didn't mention was that each one sort of looks at particular architectural languages as well. And each work is also site responsive. I think, like, thinking of the white cube space, the work that I thought I'd speak about was this one's called Frayed Continuum, and I often actually, this is great because Duncan's here, and he's been he was one of the first people who'd curated one of these works into a space and really had to sort of fight for it because of all the safety issues that one would have with a moving work. And this work actually has 9 fragments that come from architecture, but these are actually collected from buildings that were broken or dilapidated or completely demolished, and often end up in salvage stores to be sold as sculpture. And this one has 9 different fragments that then dip into a cement bath and sort of have this layering of the new story on top of itself. And the works are site-specific in terms that I'm measuring the walls and the heights and widths of each space because they have so much residue that sort of comes into the space as well. So even though the works are quite contained within their own structure, they for example, this particular one's called Freight Continuum Pendulum, and it actually sort of has an interaction. And because they're wooden, they start to erase one another. So thinking of like ways in which conflict leads to a kind of erasure of identity. But you see that residue on the floor. It sort of accumulates over the course of the exhibition, becoming a very physical remnant of that story. And on the other hand, this is a work that we recently completed early this month. And this was, we're contributing to the sort of research on stepwells. This particular work, we had to sort of go in and measure each step and recreate the entire stepwell in 3D software to sort of work out how to create the work for it. Partly also because we kept getting the measurements wrong and we had to keep going back and remeasuring it, because these are sandstone stepwells, and this particular one was created in 1780, so it's been over 240 years. And even though it looks symmetrical, it isn't, and so no step is the same. This particular space was one that resonated with me quite a lot because it was created by a woman named Gulab Rai, who was first sold as a slave, then entered the royal court as a kavas. Ka means to eat and vas means to stay. So someone who would stay and eat in the space. And then was entered the sort of king's vicinity as a pardayat, which would then be what a concubine is. And then rose the ranks to a paswan. And a paswan is a confidant of the king. So her presence actually threatened a lot of people in the royal court. And so they tried to, because of her past, kind of erase her history, but also completely sideline her presence. In terms that even her son, who was almost 18, died mysteriously. She actually, to create her space in history, started to commission architecture. And it starts with a sagar, a lake, a mahal, a palace, and then the stepwell. Unfortunately, it's a stepwell. This is in Jodhpur, which is in Rajasthan, and Jodhpur has a walled city, so this is one of the stepwells in the walled city. The thing is, even the auto walas, like the people who drive tuk-tuks, did not know that it existed. So it had been in such massive disrepair that when we went there, we were still sort of trying to push to get it cleaned up. And there has been a lot of effort towards that. The work is reflective as such that it completely either hides itself from plain sight, the way in which a stepwell is under the ground and hidden under the horizon in many ways, and can also completely blindside you in terms that when the sun is shining, there's parts of it that you can't see at all. So there's a play on visibility and invisibility, but the arches here all reference architecture from 13 stepwells, including this particular space, Maila Bagh Jhalra, that were all commissioned by women. And a lot of these were sort of known because of inscriptions on the walls, but a lot of times women would then inscribe their, the king's name or someone else's name, basically a man's instead of their own because it wasn't their place. Or would, we would only know about it through oral histories of folk music or folk tales. And so 13 of them sort of came together in this space, and that was a very sort of site-specific response to it, where like either this thing absorbs the jhalra into itself or like reflects it out. Okay.
Great, thank you. Actually, before we move on to Cui Jie, I have a follow-up question of this particular work, because during launch we're also talking about how you're interested in dystopic cinema, and also this idea of sci-fi and also different versions of futurism. And I really see this work has this very, very fascinating collapsing of different worlds with the Asian architecture and the materiality and this deliberate selection of very shiny, reflective, I don't know, it's aluminum or stainless steel. Like it has this really kind of sci-fi and futuristic imagery or imaginations that we have. Maybe you can speak a little bit more of that aspect of your work. I also find it very fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, for this, like having the presence of the glitch and fragmentation was very vital to this conversation. Also to just think of ways in which the artists sort of connect with one another or distort one another as they sort of made their presence known while you're walking through this space. But also, like, one thing I just never speak about is that I have had phases of gaming, and a lot of that, like, visual language is something I'm really interested in. There's a series of drawings that I've done that are called, they're called hybrid amalgamations, histo-futuristic, because I feel like we couldn't talk about a futurism in India without taking the visual sort of historical language ahead with us, but also imagining what like ruin would look like of what we have today, what even biomorphic architecture then becomes when abandoned. And we are seeing so many of these like vital spaces that have been completely abandoned today that we're finding so much nuance in. And I think, yeah, that's my interest.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now we're gonna move on to Cui Jie. Here we show a nice portrait of you, but I also passed the clicker to you so you can have control. Yeah, and I really like this picture because it shows all the research that you're doing around your painting, because if I remember correctly, these are these ceramic objects that you found in flea market that also represents a very particular aesthetic and historical moment of the Chinese household. I've been following your practice for many years, and you are primarily a painter. And you find most of your inspirations from the urban environment of different cities. I think a lot I see is from your hometown, Shanghai, which is also my hometown. And I'm curious also first to start by how did these urban space and environment become interesting to you? Why do you want to depict them in your paintings?
Okay, I want to say a little about Ayesha's works. Yeah. I'm so glad to learn your works. I think they are truly impressive, and yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, and I'm so I'm real honored to be here with all of you to have this talking with Xiaoyu and Ayesha, and. Xiaoyu, thank you so much for the invitation, and I also want to thank Tanoto Art Foundation for supporting my artwork in the Singapore Biennale. Xiaoyu and I have known each other for a long time. Yeah, you know my work very well. Okay, I'll speak in Mandarin, and Judy will kindly help me for the translation. Thank you so much for your help. 回到刚才笑语的那个问题，就是关于我的上海身份和我的创作之间的这个关系。比较有趣的一点是，虽然我是上海人，但是其实在我住在上海的时候，我从来没有关注过城市的这个风景，没有关注过建筑，包括雕塑，包括我之后创作的这个主题。然后我开始关注这个城市的，就是这种现代化的进程，是在我25岁的时候，我搬到北京，然后我 作为一个南方人，我对就是北京的这个城市不是很适应，它太干燥了，城市太大了，然后给我一种非常男性权利的这种感觉。然后其实刚开始我是通过绘画来习惯这个北京我不适应的这个城市，所以这是比较有趣的一点，是我发觉当我离上海有足够的距离的时候，其实我感受到更多我和这种城市规划和这种现代性之间的这个关系。然后
Thank you. Back to the question that Xiaoyu asked earlier, talking about the relationship between identity and also my creation. What is very interesting is that I'm actually from Shanghai. So it's got to do with back then, when I was in Shanghai, I didn't really take note of the buildings, the landscapes, or even the sculptures. But only when I was 25 years old, I moved to Beijing. That's when I started to take note, because Beijing was a different place, a different city. It was a lot bigger, and the climate was something that I wasn't adapted to. It was really dry, and even the city itself was very masculine. There's a lot of power play there. So for me, I started using painting as a way for me to adapt and to deal with the changes. And also the fact that in Beijing it is away from Shanghai, where I'm actually from the southern part of Shanghai. So the distance itself helped me to think about urban planning and also modernity.
Thank you. 然后回到这个画面上的这个展览 ，Species as Gifts。其实这个展览是在疫情之后，然后经历过上海的这个封锁的那个好几个月，然后我重新开始回到这个公共的生活的时候，我试图去走访这些上海的这些公共空间，然后去观察，就是跟我一样经历过这个疫情的人是怎么在恢复秩序之后，跟这个上海的公共空间产生一种关联，然后重新回到一些日常的生活，然后治愈在这个 COVID 的这个过程当中受到的一些创伤吧。
Yeah, so this visual that you're seeing is actually my research, where it came with the theme species as gifts. It was actually created post-COVID, after the lockdown period for a few months back then. It was my exploration where the people like me who had experienced the lockdown, coming back to the public space again, that was when I started to walk around the spaces. I was also observing people, how they were dealing with life back to daily movements, and how they were finding the relationship with the public space again. So it was very much work and creation, trying to find healing from the trauma in some sense.
然后这个过程中，我就发觉，就是因为上海也是一个有历史的一个城市，然后它最早的这个公园其实是在法租界，就是在这些租界区。然后另一条线索的话，它有很多老的园林，然后经历过这种社会主义的改造，然后它变成了一个公共空间，就是开放给这个城市的居民。然后在这个过程当中，所以有不同的线索，让这些公共空间经历了这种很多的变化。然后，有这种私人的园林到这样的一个公共空间的这种改造，也有从殖民地的这些公园到就是社会主义的这种改建。然后在这个过程当中，这些空间经历了很多的变化，包括在这个空间当中的很多植物、动物、雕塑，甚至空间本身也经历了一些变化。所以我就在这个画面当中呢，其实这个所有的墙面都是根据上海我最喜欢的一个公园所建造的。 它叫东安公园。然后它在清代的时候是一个私人的一个园林，是一个以贵族的古代的贵族视角出发的这么一个空间。然后经历了建国到那个社会主义的改建之后，它发生了很多变化，从贵族的视角转换到了这个公众的这个视角，然后这个当中的植物们，然后雕塑们也经历一些变化。我觉得这个变化本身是很有趣的。
So this is actually a process where I observed Shanghai changes with history. There were parks back then, many years back. We had these spaces we called the concession sites. These concession sites were leased spaces where there were parks. So there were gardens and spaces for the communal area. And then there were also changes in terms of the social ideals, where the space has become a public space for the residents in the city. There were many leads that I found in my research back then, and I observed many changes from personal gardens to public spaces. There were also colonial parks back then, colonialism to social buildings. So there were many changes there in terms of the species, in terms of botanics, plants, sculptures, buildings. So all these actually experienced changes, transformation over time. So I took walks from Shanghai, and one of them, my favorite one, is Dong'an Park in Shanghai. Back then it was the Qing dynasty, and it was a space for the rich class, the rich people back then. So the space actually developed into a public space. So there is a change in terms of perspective. The sculpture changes, the buildings. So the transformation over time is something that I found interesting.
然后我想说，我另外的一个项目是在英国的，然后在 Essex Falcon Point Gallery， 然后那个城市离我非常的遥远，但是我还是回到我的一个个人经验，因为这个展览 New Modern Village 其实是关于我曾经，我是出生在上海的工人新村。并不是第一代的，但是它会有相关性，所以这个展览另一方面也是关于 COVID 的，因为我在 COVID 期间我就开始思考，曾经我在这个工人新村长大的这种环境，其实那个是一个很紧密的社区，我们都来自同一个学校，因为当时我还是个小孩，然后我们的父母都来自同一个工厂的工人。有纺织厂、钢铁厂，然后那样的一个环境，人与人之间的关系非常的紧密。然后我在 COVID 期间，在封锁在我的这个小房子里的时候，我就开始想，我们现在要隔1米的距离，我们建筑和人的关系产生了很大的变化，从是一种禁锢的这种关系，然后曾经的这种社会主义的这种集体的生活。似乎离我们那么遥远，所以你可以看到这上面有一些画，其实关于画，这些工人新村曾经我记忆中的这些人与人之间的这个关系，然后包括。
Next, the project that I worked on is called the New Model Village. This was exhibited in London, Essex, at the Focal Point Gallery. Even though this place was really far from me, but it also reminds me of a personal experience. In the New Modern Village, I was actually born in one of them years back. And although it wasn't the first generation, but they did exist. And also in COVID period, that was where that I wanted to explore how I was confined in that space because of the lockdown period, how human and human, we were only allowed 1 meter space, and how this actually translate in terms of the relationship as a building within the walls, and how we had to keep that distance. And for me, I actually grew up in one of these new model villages. The kids at my age, we grew up in the same school. Our parents worked in the same factories. There were textile, steel factories, and all that. So we had a common factors in terms of experience back then. And then looking at this again from the perspective after COVID or during COVID, the lockdown, how humans and buildings have that relationship.
因为就是 XX 那个时期，在1930几年的时期，它也有2个厂，一个 Bata 的鞋厂，然后还有一个玻璃厂，然后他们其实当然背景是完全不一样的，但是他们当时找了很多移民的，就是欧洲移民的这些工人，然后也是建立了类似于这样的工人的一个社区，然后有咖啡馆，有游泳池，然后就是所有的人都相互认识，然后所以。在这个展览上也有一些就是 archive 的，就是关于这种上海的这个曾经的工人新村和 SX 的这些工人的社群之间的关系。然后比如说这件的话，其实就是曾经的上海的工人新村，的类似于一个宣传的这种照片，在描述曾经的，就是在这个工人新村里的这些工人的标兵是如何恋爱的，就是对，然后我有描绘，sorry。
So the work that was shown in Essex was that there was a similarity there between Shanghai new workers' villages and Essex. Back then in Essex, London, around that area, there were 2 factories manufacturing shoes and glass. Though there were different, these 2 had very different backgrounds, but there were similarities there. They had European workers, immigrants, and an intentional kind of utopian building in terms of the space and community. They had cafes, they had pools, they had schools. So there was a community there. Everybody knew each other. So from the picture earlier, you could see from the slide that there were archive research materials that recorded the history back then. So in Shanghai, back to the new workers' villages, there was this picture that you are looking at. It reflects the relationship, a couple that was actually dating and in a relationship. So there were many pieces of information that I gathered in my research collection.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add a little bit about this, because I think this is a detailed, maybe zoom in of a propaganda poster that you're probably referring to, where at the time the propagandas will show the sort of model relationships of how young people date and what is the exemplified kind of actions and stuff. So I think this is a detail from that. Yeah, I haven't seen this series of work. It's very interesting. I did have the honor to see the first work you showed at the West Bond Museum. It's very beautiful, and I'm really interested in one thing that you really kind of talked in detail of how you are able to connect with very intimate personal relationship in your upbringing with the so-called more grand narrative of modernization and socialism in China, which I think is the best part and can touch a lot of people, even though the topic might be pretty grandiose in a sense. I think this is your last slide, and we have more questions after, but I also want to, maybe you can talk a little bit about your painting process in terms of how do you translate all these research, because you are a painter, but you're not only just depicting an image or creating a narrative in your work. There are a lot of reference, there are a lot of materials, you do a lot of in-depth research surrounding your work. So I'm just curious, how do you translate these materials into your painterly world?
这个是一个对我来说就是非常重要的问题。然后我回到这个我在 Westbound Museum 的这个关于上海的这个展览，然后因为我的求学的经历就是 Fine Art， 所以我在我上学的时候其实是没有学习过关于城市规划、关于建筑方面的知识。然后我了解的其实就是绘画，这是一个非常传统的 对一个工具。所以当我对这个城市的这种城市规划，对于这种现代性产生质疑和产生困惑的时候，我就开始用我最熟悉的这个方式，就是绘画，也是一个最传统的一个方式，然后去进入到一个我完全就是不熟悉的，完全我是一个外行的这么一个领域。这个过程其实对我来说是一个很有趣的，就是我一直觉得我就是像一个普通的一个城市体验者在体验这个城市，但是在这个过程当中，其实我是想要去发掘，就是这个现代性，包括在中国我出生然后长大的这个30-40年，然后这个城市的速度，城市的这个规划如此之快，就是然后这种速度作为一种常态，它是怎么建构我的这个思维方式，然后建构怎么影响我这一代人的。所以对，但是又是通过这么一个绘画的方式，所以我一直觉得我像是一个企图像一个城市规划者一样去画画。这个其实当中其实是有一些冲突的，但是对这个包括这个展览上，其实我收集了非常多的关于上海的这些老的公园的照片，然后你可以看到，其实这个就是动物园，上海动物园的一些照片。然后这个是曾经上海在49年的时候受到台风侵袭，然后它的这个公共空间被淹掉的这么一个状况。
So the question that you ask is very important to me. So I'll go back to this exhibition in Westburn Museum in Shanghai. So for me, my training was in fine arts, very traditional painting. So to work with architectural is something that is not what I'm training. I'm not expert in that, but I wanted to use something that I am very comfortable with, I know a lot about, that is using painting as my tool to work with urban planning and modernization. So it's very much like when I had doubts and questions about how these cities are rapidly developing, I wanted to use what I was comfortable with, I was best at, to create this ability to address these doubts and questions. So it's out of my own personal experience as an ordinary person, not as an expert in urban planning. So using arts and painting to deal with that, and also to discover modern living in China, because over the last 40 years, 30 to 40 years of growth, we've seen how these cities really develop very, very rapidly. And this rapid development has become a new norm. I wanted to explore how this new norm impact my generation of people. So through my drawing, I'm looking at how the urban planning works. And lastly, I was just looking at these slides that you can see the materials that I've gathered, and I wanted to present in the exhibition. You see the gardens, the different parks, that's the Shanghai Zoo, and also back then when the typhoon hit the city, the destruction that it has actually caused.
Yeah, and I remember seeing the exhibition because some of these are the tickets to enter the park and zoo, and we all know that we don't use paper tickets anymore nowadays. It's all QR code and scanning, so these become really valuable and cherished artifacts. I think it's also very interesting in terms of how you put the archives together through your work. Okay, so now we're going to move on to maybe talk a little bit about your work in the biennial. And I think it's a good segue also to talk about your painting process, because it's a very big work, very large scale. It's 2 meters by 7 meters, over 7 meters, and you will all have the honor to see it if you go to the biennial. So maybe tell us a little bit about this work.
Sure. 这件作品 Thermal Landscape 其实我也是开始就是关于 Thermal Landscapes 的这系列的作品也是在疫情的期间，然后我开始思考就是这些摩天大楼在这样的一个不可持续的就是能源的 危机，这个气候的危机的这个现实下，就是他们仍旧掌控着我们的天际线，然后成为这种现代巨型城市然后的一个象征。所以我当时开始画一些就是中东、非洲一些我没有去过的城市，当然现在其中有一些城市我已经去过了，但在当时我没有去过。然后，但他们有同样的美学，然后跟上海的、北京的一些建筑似乎有着相似的这个经历，因为这些城市也经历了，像中国的这些大城市一样的这种现代化的这个进程。然后回到这件作品的话，它其实是关于海上丝绸之路的。然后在这个海上丝绸之路上，有很多这种除了这个瓷器，然后也有很多这些植物，包括海洋的这些生物，因为就是船只它会有这个压舱土和这个压舱水，然后会有很多的这些植物，种子，包括一些就是海洋的生物，随着这些压舱土和压舱水，会被被动的交易到世界的各地去。然后，我当时在做这个项目的时候，也了解到新加坡其实收集了很多这些植物的种子，包括这些海洋生物的标本，然后在它的就是原产地，就是原生地，其实已经被变化了，已经消失了。然后我觉得这个也是我就是觉得很有趣的一点。然后另一方，
谢谢。Now, if I talk about this new project, Thermal Landscapes, it was also created during COVID period. I was reflecting on skyscrapers in a very climate challenged environment where are we able to sustain building these skyscrapers and towering in cities. So it was a reflection of the city landscapes. In fact, some of the cities when I first created, I was never there before, but recently I did visit a few like in Middle East. So these are the cities that we can draw similarities where they are also very rapidly developing, and you question about the sustainability with, whether we are able to sustain that. So, and then moving on, you would also see that I'm also exploring this maritime Silk Road where I had the ceramic pieces. It was looking at the coral, the ecosystem. There are many species out there. So back then, during the maritime Silk Road, there were many ships and vessels that were traveling around. So in order for these vessels and ships to find stability, they had these basals and storage area at the lower decks. So my work actually featured some of these intricate details of the Silk Road development.
Yeah, and also I think just to add a little bit, Cui Jie was mentioning there will be these animal specimens and seeds that kind of hidden and accidentally being involuntarily kind of traded to different places along the routes. And actually, Singapore also kept some of these seeds, which in their original homeland that has already metamorphosed and transformed. So there is a very interesting relationship about these migration.
然后另一方面的话，其实也就是关于这些建筑，其实我最早的想法是要画一些关于新加坡的观景台。然后，因为就是观景台对我来说一直是一个非常重要的一个事情，一个东西。然后，因为我刚刚回到我最初在北京的时候，其实在北京天桥对我来说是一个很重要的一个观景台，它是在城市的中间。然后，在我小时候的时候，那我的观景台就是地面，我需要仰看那些建筑。然后，在我 来到新加坡做研究的时候，我会觉得这些建筑，这些之前的 hotel 的楼上的这个旋转餐厅是一个很好的一个观景台。然后当我去到中东的时候，我就发觉你没有办法，就比如说你去中东，你看这个人工岛那个棕榈岛，它根本不是为了人的视觉去观看的，它是让你在卫星上，让你在直升飞机上。所以另一方面，技术的更迭已经完全改变了我们与风景之间的关系。其实观看风景是一个非常权利和非常有意思的这么一个事情，而风景与权利之间的关系也是我一直在思考的这个话题。
So if you were to look at the buildings, what is very important to me, it's also the observation decks, the watchtowers. This is something that it reflects the cities that I was in Beijing. I used to look around the landscape standing at the overhead bridge. These overhead bridges are in the center of the city. And I was younger in Shanghai, I will be looking from the ground, looking at the landscapes and the architecture. And then coming to Singapore, I've noticed that there are the revolving restaurant at the top of the hotel, right at the top of the building. So these actually culminate the perspectives that I have from different eyes that I get to see the landscape, the relationship. And then if you look at Middle East, you have the Palm Island, the artificial building. So to be able to appreciate the pattern and the work, you can't see it from our eyes. You actually have to see it from the sky, either through the satellite or from the airplane. So through a different lens, I was actually trying to explore how we can appreciate the landscape through different eyes, and how technology, and because of this, the palm, the artificial reclaimed land itself, that we are able to appreciate this landscape and the building from a different perspective, and technology advancement and transformation has allowed us to look at this pattern from the sky from a different lens.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Cui Jie. It's very interesting when you mentioned in the end about sort of the relationship between landscape and looking, and also the inherent violence it kind of put forward through modernism and modernity, especially with technology and technological advancement. So I want to go back to Ayesha, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work in the biennial as well, and connect to your earlier work, your practice overall, and after also hearing Cui Jie talking about her practice, be interesting to hear a little bit more. How did you respond also to the theme of the biennial and creating this work?
Oh, thank you. So the theme of the biennial is pure intention, and I know I said the word like Puritan rhetoric in the beginning, so I was connecting what sort of pure means today, but I remember reading a part of the concept note that spoke about the way in which the curators have also invited other curatorial collectives to sort of respond to even their own pure intentions. And you'd used this phrase of polyvocal, I think it was polyvocal responses. And I was quite interested in that because this work inherently sort of, this is the fourth of a series of sort of public sculptural line drawings called Continuous Coexistences. And the work sort of thinks about coexistence, but also dissimilarities, disjunctures, displayed as a continuous line drawing in space. And this particular work, well, like the first step of creating this work, especially in a city or responding to a city where I don't live and I haven't spent that much time, the first step for us was sort of to start to speak to local historians, professors, theorists, but also friends who've lived in the city or people who've been here for a long time, to see in which ways in which like they respond to the history or even traverse the spaces. And so this particular work, there's a way in which, well, it doesn't respond to history in a chronological way. It sort of looks at the way in which we encounter a city, and that's often, well, you're not going to have like 14th century architecture in one place and then all the sort of contemporary or modern architecture in one cluster, and then encounter the next sort of series or thought or idea, right? So same in that way, it's a mixture of various things layering one on top of the other as you walk around and experience the entire thing. And the work sort of, just how I'd initially sort of mentioned the sort of opening and flattening, if you think of it through time and the way in which time functions, when we're looking at a space through different perspectives, the work features a sort of amalgamated timeline. And this, for Singapore, looks at pre-1800 architecture, contested, and then also looking at British colonization, Japanese occupation, post-war migration and trade on one side, and then also forgotten histories, abandoned spaces, destroyed architecture as well. And so the work is actually placed in Fort Canning. Fort Canning was the first place where the Union Jack was hoisted by the British, but also the first place that they set up headquarters. And it's quite curious the way in which this happens on hills in various cities, including Delhi, where the Viceroy's house is over a hill, or in Perth, where the first sort of roundhouse is created on a hill. But the idea of creating architecture of surveillance. This is next to the now recreated, or which was recreated in 2003, Raffles House, and it's in the garden next to it, which is a very particular sort of space for me, because one of the things that many historians spoke about when we spoke to them about the history of Singapore was the question around how little we know about what happened before Raffles came here. So what happened before the 1800s, what was here before, how little sort of is written. And there were particular sort of authors that were recommended to me to see ways in which different people from different countries actually wrote about what they had seen or encountered in what was Singapore before. And this work sort of brings together a lot of those ideas, but in a space which could also help us sort of question that sort of recontextualization of history. Because Raffles House otherwise was in another spot. It was broken down in the 1850s and then recreated in 2003, which is a very particular action. And this work brings together various spaces, including Iskandar Shah's tomb, Keramat, which is very close to this location, but also comes from a conversation that I had with another theorist who'd written about Habib Noh and Habib Noh's Keramat, which is in Singapore, but also Habib Noh as a saint who actually spent time in Singapore and walked this land. And it also looks at the old Changi Hospital, which was abandoned, the old National Theatre, which was destroyed, also spaces of cultural congregation, like the first Gurdwara that was created here. The Peninsula Plaza, also Little Burma, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, there are more than 15 spaces that sort of come together to create this particular work. This is one part of it, and then there's a larger work on the other side of it. And in many ways, it's sort of, yeah, we're not showing you everything. You have to go experience the work. But it sort of frames the city as well. So in many ways, you see the history through its own sort of portals, but then also the rest of the city through it. Is that good? Yeah.
It's really great. Thank you both. And I also see how your work really become a way of history recording and history writing in a sense, and also even kind of reviving and resurrect certain things that are already, you know, in the past and perhaps on the verge of being forgotten. I think that's a new kind of relationship I discovered in talking through both of you. Now we have a few minutes for the audience, and we'd like to open it up. And if you have one or two questions, we're happy to take it. Anyone? No? Okay, that's fine. And we can wrap it up. And also I do, please do come and speak to the artist if you're too shy to ask a question. We will have another maybe 15, 20 minutes also. You can grab another bite or drink, and then we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming, and please stay tuned for our next program. But of course, please do check out the works in the biennial. Thank you very much. Thanks.